The black SUV glided through the streets of the city, its tinted windows shielding them from prying eyes. Maximilian sat in the back seat, arms crossed, his expression one of practiced boredom. But inside, he was anything but indifferent. Christian was driving, his hands steady on the wheel, his jaw set in that familiar, unreadable way. Alan, sitting in the passenger seat, was scrolling through his phone, occasionally humming to himself. Maximilian could still feel the weight of last night's kiss pressing against his lips, still hear Christian's voice in his head. "You don't have to do anything, you just have to accept it." He clenched his fists. "Like hell I will." "Where exactly are we going?" Maximilian finally asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Christian didn't glance at him. "Your father has arranged a meeting with a business associate. You're expected to be there." Maximilian scoffed. "Of course, always trying to parade me around like a prize." Alan turned in his seat, grinning. "Oh, come on, Max. A little schmoozing, some fancy hors d'oeuvres, maybe some boring speeches. What's not to love?" Maximilian shot him a glare. "Remind me why you're here again?" Alan grinned wider. "Moral support." Maximilian rolled his eyes, shifting uncomfortably. He could feel Christian's presence in the driver's seat, solid, unwavering, and far too close. The tension between them was unbearable, thick like summer heat before a thunderstorm. Christian finally spoke, his voice steady. "This isn't just about your father. It's about your safety." Maximilian let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, please. What? Are you afraid someone's going to throw a canapé at me?" Christian's grip tightened on the wheel. "Your accident wasn't just an accident." That made Maximilian pause. "What?" Christian glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his green eyes sharp. "There was a report. The car that hit you. It wasn't a coincidence." A cold weight settled in Maximilian's chest. He sat up straighter. "You're saying someone did it on purpose?" Christian gave a slight nod. "That's what we're looking into." For once, Maximilian didn't have a smart remark. Alan stretched in his seat. "So, yeah, maybe try not to run off like a rebellious teenager while we're supposed to be protecting you." Maximilian exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against his thigh. "Fine, but don't think this means I trust either of you." Christian didn't react. "I don't need your trust, Maximilian. Just your cooperation." Maximilian turned his gaze out the window, watching the city blur past. But his mind wasn't on the meeting ahead. It was on Christian, on the way his voice sounded in the dark, the way his lips felt, the way he made Maximilian want things he shouldn't want. This wasn't just a dangerous situation. It was a dangerous game. And Maximilian was already losing. The building loomed in front of them, a sleek, modern structure of glass and steel that reflected the setting sun. The car pulled up to the entrance, where a valet was already waiting. Christian was the first to step out, his posture imposing and calm, as if he belonged in this world of wealth and influence. Alan followed suit, stretching out his long limbs with exaggerated nonchalance, clearly enjoying the atmosphere. Maximilian hesitated for a moment before sliding out of the car, his gaze flicking back to Christian. "Stay close," Christian ordered, his voice steady as he met Maximilian's eyes for just a moment. There was no softness there, only the professionalism that Maximilian both resented and craved. Maximilian ignored the shiver running down his spine and rolled his shoulders, a gesture of defiance. "I don't need anyone holding my hand, especially not you." Christian's eyes didn't flinch, even as the corners of his mouth tightened. "This isn't about holding your hand. It's about keeping you alive." Maximilian wasn't sure which part stung more, the fact that Christian was so calm or the fact that he was right. The weight of last week's accident settled heavily in his chest again. He tried to shake it off, but it lingered, like an unwanted shadow. The building was opulent, with polished marble floors and high ceilings that echoed with quiet conversations and the clink of fine glassware. Maximilian had been to events like this before, but today it felt different. The weight of his father's expectations, his own growing frustration, and the unspoken tension between him and Christian made everything feel suffocating. Alan led them through the crowd, weaving past guests with practiced ease, while Maximilian kept his eyes trained on Christian. His bodyguard was always within arm's reach, and despite his defiance, Maximilian couldn't seem to shake the sense of security he felt when Christian was near. "This is all a charade," Maximilian muttered under his breath, trying to distract himself. "A game where I'm just a pawn." Christian's gaze flicked to him, his voice low and controlled. "You think I don't know that? I'm here for your protection, not to play pretend." Maximilian didn't reply. He wasn't sure how to respond to the truth in Christian's words, or to the realization that, even in the middle of all this, Christian was still protecting him. The event progressed, speeches were made, drinks were served, and Maximilian made a conscious effort to stay aloof. He smiled at the right people, exchanged pleasantries, and did everything in his power to maintain the illusion of disinterest. But his mind kept drifting back to Christian, those intense green eyes, the quiet authority that radiated from him, and the lingering feeling that, despite all his protests, something was changing between them. Finally, after what felt like hours of strained small talk, Maximilian found himself standing on the edge of the balcony, the cool night air, a welcome relief from the stuffy atmosphere inside. He leaned against the railing, his eyes focused on the lights of the city below, but his thoughts were anything but peaceful. "Thought you might need some air," Christian's voice broke through the silence, though his presence was felt long before the sound of his footsteps reached Maximilian's ears. Maximilian didn't turn around. "You're still following me?" he asked, though the question lacked its usual bite. Christian moved to stand beside him, his posture relaxed, though his gaze never left Maximilian. "I'm not following you. I'm just doing my job." There was a beat of silence before Maximilian spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You're good at your job." Christian's eyes flicked to him, and for the briefest moment, Maximilian thought he saw something more than just professionalism. But before he could analyze it, Christian looked away. "That's what I'm here for," he replied, his voice distant, guarded. "To make sure you don't make any mistakes." Maximilian felt the familiar sting of frustration. "You don't think I can handle myself?" Christian's gaze met his again, sharp and unwavering. "You think your father would have hired me if he thought you could handle it on your own?" Maximilian clenched his jaw, but didn't answer. He hated that Christian was right, hated that his father didn't trust him. But more than that, he hated how Christian made him feel, like he wasn't in control of his own life anymore. Another long silence passed between them, the city lights flickering like distant stars. Maximilian's mind raced, his emotions tangled in a chaotic mess of anger, desire, and something he couldn't quite name. And then, without thinking, he spoke the words that had been building inside him all night. "Why are you doing this, Christian?" Christian didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "I'm doing my job," he repeated, "and I'll keep doing it as long as you need me." Maximilian let out a bitter laugh. "I don't need you. I don't need anyone." Christian turned to him, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made Maximilian stop, something raw, something vulnerable, buried beneath the layers of professionalism. "Sometimes," Christian said quietly, his voice soft yet heavy with meaning, "we don't get to choose who we need." Maximilian's heart skipped a beat, his chest tightened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something other than anger or defiance. He felt uncertainty, and that terrified him. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Maximilian muttered, turning his gaze back to the city below. Christian didn't reply. He didn't need to, because Maximilian knew that despite all his resistance, despite all his attempts to push him away, Christian was right there, standing beside him, waiting. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, like a storm that had yet to break. Maximilian could feel Christian's presence next to him, like an anchor, grounding him in a way he wasn't ready to admit. His heart thudded in his chest as he tried to pull away from the emotions swirling inside him. "You shouldn't be here," Maximilian muttered, not looking at Christian. "You're just doing your job. That's all this is." Christian's gaze never left him, steady and calm. "Maybe that's how you want to see it. But I'm not just here to do a job, Maximilian." His voice was low, edged with something deeper. "I'm here to protect you, to keep you safe from yourself." Maximilian's breath caught in his throat. There it was again, that thing he didn't want to acknowledge. The way Christian's words somehow cut through the wall he had so carefully built around himself. "You don't need to protect me," Maximilian said, though it sounded more like a plea than the defiant declaration he wanted it to be. Christian's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to wrestle with something inside himself. Then he stepped closer, the heat of his body brushing against Maximilian's side. The space between them was small, too small. Maximilian could feel the pull of it, the tension vibrating in the air, thick and undeniable. "Maybe I don't need to," Christian said softly. "But I want to." Maximilian swallowed hard, the words striking deeper than he wanted to admit. He wanted to push him away, to shove this moment aside as just another thing he couldn't control. But something about Christian's presence, the steady calm of his touch, made it feel like the walls Maximilian had built around himself were crumbling, piece by piece. "You don't get it," Maximilian whispered, though it felt more like a confession. "You don't understand how it feels to be trapped in a life where nothing's really yours. My father—" He stopped, clenching his fists. "He doesn't see me, Christian. He sees an heir, a role to be filled, a prize to be paraded." Christian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved closer, his hand brushing against Maximilian's shoulder in a quiet gesture of reassurance. "Your father may not see you the way you want," Christian said, his voice steady. "But I see you. I see you, Maximilian." Maximilian's breath hitched in his throat, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. Everything, the event, the expectations, the game he was playing faded into the background. All that was left was the quiet intensity of Christian's gaze, the weight of his words. "I didn't ask for this," Maximilian murmured, barely able to meet his eyes. "I didn't ask for any of this." "I know," Christian said, his voice softer now. "But sometimes we don't get to choose what we need." The words hung in the air between them like a confession, something both terrifying and liberating. Maximilian felt the heat rise in his chest, his heart racing as he realized what he was feeling and what he had been avoiding. Christian stepped back slightly, the sudden distance making Maximilian feel cold. "I won't force you, Maximilian, but I won't leave you to sink either." He let out a breath, a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh. "You're not alone in this." Maximilian opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips. He wanted to say something, anything, but what could he say? How could he voice the confusion that churned inside him? He hated this, hated the vulnerability, hated— "Let's just get through tonight," Maximilian finally said, his voice tight, his gaze focused on the ground. "We'll deal with everything else later." Christian didn't argue, didn't try to press further. He only nodded, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said quietly, stepping back toward the doors. "But remember, Maximilian, whatever happens, I'm here." Maximilian didn't reply. He couldn't. Not yet.